I have taken 40 years to put the story together. And the story is a compelling one. It centers around the Founding Fathers and what they said. And everyone, before you understand, oh good, this is on now. It was off. Thanks, Tom. I thought you were a friend. Anyway, if you want to understand what the Constitution means and not listen to your neighbor or the media or something else, you've got to read this book. It's the Federalist Papers. You have to read the Federalist Papers. Because Madison, Jay, and Hamilton knew what or whereof they spoke. It's a very difficult read, but you've got to discipline yourself to read that, and we're going to go through this a little bit tonight. I want to tell you, the country starts right here in our own community. We recently had an issue, and the issue is ongoing, on a history book. It's called American Pageant. I had the happy opportunity to spend 7 to 8 hours with it, online and at the schools. They took a vote the other night, and my buddy back there, Stu Sennett, was there, and he gave a testimony, and I also gave one, on the book and what the content of it is. Very few have read it. I doubt if the school board took a lot of time reading it. It is not a book that 10th grade advanced placement students should be reading, because it has an agenda to it, it has a bias to it, and if anybody studies this carefully, they'll pick it up. I read the school board 12 points that were scurrilous, in my opinion, and I couldn't read all of it because I had 4 pages of notes. But they were kind enough to allow some time to speak. But I want to tell you something. It's very important to know American history, because you can know reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's important. But if you don't know your American history, you lose the country. And we can't lose the country. We have to have the country. Because all those wonderful rights that you have, the inalienable rights, nobody can alienate those rights. They can't take them away. They're God-given rights. Governments do take them away. But we have to know what the basis of this is. Now, I want to start out with Frank Sinatra. He was a great philosopher. And in 1945, he was in a picture called The House I Live In. And in that picture, he had a group of young people wanting to know about America. He told them what America was. And I'm going to have this on. Mary, why don't you play this? About 3 minutes. And here's what America is.
What is America to me? A name, a map, or a flag I see. A certain word, democracy. What is America to me? A house I live in, a plot of earth, a street, a grocer and a butcher, and the people that I meet, the children in the playground, the faces that I see, all races and religions. That's America to me. The place I work in, the worker at my side, the little town or city where my people lived and died, the howdy and the handshake, the air of feeling free, and the right to speak my mind out. That's America to me. The things I see about me, the big things and the small, the little corner newsstand and the house a mile tall, the wedding and the churchyard, the laughter and the tears, the dream that's been a-growing for 150 years. The town I live in, the street, the house, the room, pavement of the city, or a garden all in bloom, the church, the school, the clubhouse, the million lights I see, but especially the people. That's America to me.
Go on, Lynn.
That's it. That's it. That's it. You know, something's happened since 1945. Something's happened to America. And we have to understand, how did we get to where we got to? How did America in 1905 become a nation that was producing half of the goods in the world? Consuming half, producing half. 1905. We had people coming from the Slavic countries in Europe. They were banging the doors down to come to America. We didn't have enough jobs to offer. It was unbelievable. The economics of America was bursting at that time. Well, there were certain principles that we based this on, and there was a certain man that had the vision for America. You know who that was? One man saw what America should be, and he saw it in advance. And he was 6'2". He had freckles, and he knew 7 languages. He spoke fluently. And can you hear me on this, by the way? And he was our 3rd president, by the way, author of the Declaration of Independence. His name is Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson, in this book I was telling you about, American Pageant, which I told you I spent about 7 to 8 hours on that book, is denigrated. If you destroyed Jefferson, you've destroyed the fabric of America. So we can't be doing that, particularly to the young, impressionable minds. Well, Thomas Jefferson looked at the landscape, and there's nobody, I believe, my opinion, is there's nobody that's lived upon this United States of America in our history that was as brilliant as Thomas Jefferson. And the brilliance was a very wide swath, wide scope. He set off the study of paleontology in the United States. What's paleontology? It's what?
Dinosaurs.
Yeah,
Dinosaurs.
yeah. It's digging bones up. It's archaeology, that kind of thing. See, some of us don't even know what paleontology is. He was, you know, he had 350 Indian languages he knew. He had that as you walked into Monticello. He had all the maps. This was a very unusual person. When you win the war, you've got to win the peace too. You got to have something to put in place. And it was Jefferson and Madison who basically are the ones who put things in place. Well, Jefferson took a look at the landscape, and he looked out and he said, you know, I've studied the Anglo-Saxons. I've studied the Anglo-Saxons, and I've studied their traditions in their original language. And it just so happens The Anglo-Saxons were from about 450 CE or AD to about 1000. And then William the Conqueror came across and took over and brought ruler's law. But the Anglo-Saxons used actually the first 5 books of the Bible, which is called the Torah. They used those 5 books, and Jefferson saw, he was well schooled in the scriptures, he had read them, and he took a look at the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and then he looked at the Anglo-Saxons, what they were doing, and said, it's the same thing. It's the same exact thing. And so he wrote to some of the other founders, and he said, this is the society that we should sculpt. And John Adams took a look at it, and he says, you know, you're right about that. Others did too. But he had the original idea. And William the Conqueror came across, and the Anglo-Saxons, now where are the Anglo-Saxons from? Let me show you a little bit here. I have a map, but the map is too small to see, so you're going to have to look at my, my drawing here. Here's Europe, okay? That's my interpretation of Europe. Okay, here's the German area. Here's Great Britain is over here. The Anglo-Saxons are from this area. And they went over here to Britain. And it was called Angleland. Later changed to England, see. So William the Conqueror came across. He became a dictator. And then in 1215, something happened. Very interesting. Let me see here. Mary, I want you to show something on the board here. The first slide.
Which one?
On the
Roots or the other one?
the antecedent documents. That's it. All right, 1215. What's this? What's going on here? Listen, let me tell you something. You know what the struggle is? You know what our struggle is? We got to go back to the Magna Carta. You need the rights that are in the Magna Carta. And they went to King John, who's one of the worst kings that's ever lived. Everybody hated him. The nobles went to him. They had a sword in his throat. And they said, you're going to sign this. We want our rights. And he had his fingers crossed in the back, and he signed it. And then he discarded it afterwards. But King John inherited the English throne from his brother Richard the Lionheart in 1199. He was very unpopular. Terrible military leader. He raised taxes to pay for his failed wars against France. The barons rebelled in 1215. The king was forced to meet with the barons and sign a document called the Magna Carta. Do we have the... I want to get the next slide too. Yeah. Just click that next slide there. All right. Now you get a lot of very important rights from the Magna Carta. The bottom of that, the right to due process. What is that, right? What is due process? You get their day in court. Now, not every country has that. Not every country's got that. That's a very important right, that you have your day in court. The right to a trial by jury of your peers. You see the picture, the 12 Angry Men? Okay. No taxation without representation. That was all in the Magna Carta. And that's been the struggle, because these rights have been lost. And then all of a sudden, in 1628, let's see, you got another slide there for me? 1628, you had this man come along. Now let me tell you something. I'm giving you this background because sometimes we don't realize the struggle that went on to put the whole story together and how the founders did this. They knew about Sir Edward, You pronounce his name Cook. It's spelled Coke. But we didn't have any Coke then. There wasn't any Pepsi either. But you pronounce it Cook. Sir Edward Cook was the primary author of the Petition of Right. Now, you had at that time a man called Charles I. He was a king. And he believed in the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings. Machiavelli wrote about that in the early 1500s. There is no such thing. That's a myth. There is no divine right of kings. But he went to his minister, Sir Edward Cook, and he said to him, is there such a thing as the divine right of kings? He said, no, there is no such thing. Boy, he got mad. And Cook wrote this Petition of Right. Within a decade before the English Civil War, some members of Parliament were complaining that the king was abusing his power and ignoring the rights granted by the Magna Carta. Now, this is 1628. The Magna Carta is 1215 in Runnymede. Drafted in the spring of 1628, the Petition of Right outlines their complaints and demands redress. All right, I think we have another slide after this. Okay, now, this man, who's my favorite, knew about the Petition of Right. He knew about the Magna Carta. He knew about all of this English history. Charles I signed the Petition of Right, and then he disbanded Parliament for 11 years. The Magna Carta says that the powers of the government have to be in the Parliament. You have to have a strong Parliament. Well, for 11 years, Charles I disbanded the Parliament, and he called them back in session. Because you needed what?
Money.
You had wars, and you needed money. So he called the Parliament back in session. Well, Parliament was very upset with Charles I, and they tried him. They tried the king. How do you like that? Now, we have in our country impeachment, but impeachment is a very difficult bar to get to because you need 2/3 of the Senate. You got to have the House vote for it, and you need 2/3 of the Senate. Impeachment is a political process. It always has been. We've never sustained an impeachment in the United States. We almost did with Andrew Johnson, but have you read Profiles in Courage? In that book, it talks about Senator Ross, the one vote that saved Johnson. And probably that was a good thing. But at this time, with Charles I and the Petition of Right, they tried Charles I because he was treasonous as well. And guess what? They told him they're going to behead him. He says, no, you're not. Now, he was sitting there with a big hat and a feather in his hat, and he was very arrogant. He said, no, you're not. And they wound up beheading Charles I. How do you like that? They beheaded him. Well, now let me take you to another man. First, I want to tell you that Jefferson had read the Petition of Right, and he drew inspiration from the Petition of Right as he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And I don't know if it's in this lesson, but I'll tell you how the Declaration of Independence came about and what happened, how it was all put together. Do you have the next slide there?
It's the other one, right?
That one. And make it a little bigger. There it is. You know who this man is?
Nope.
This is real. This is real history. I thought you knew who Algernon Sidney was. Well, you know what? The founding fathers knew who he was. They had read him. And does anybody know who he is? He was a great statesman. And I have his writings here. Now, let me tell you what he said in a nutshell, and I'll read it to you. He said, if the government becomes oppressive, you have a God-given right to overthrow it. He got beheaded. He was beheaded. And John Locke, a great philosopher, absolutely great philosopher, fled after Algernon Sidney got beheaded. But the founding fathers said the same thing 100 years later. Same thing. And here's what Sidney said in his Discourses Concerning Government. If the laws of God and men are therefore of no effect when the magistracy is left at liberty to break them, and if the lust of those who are too strong for the tribunals of justice cannot be otherwise restrained than by sedition, tumults, and war, those seditions, tumults, and wars are justified by the laws of God and man. How do you like that? And he, founders had read him, and he was beheaded. Well, we need the next slide after that. I want the slide after that. The American founding fathers were greatly influenced by Sidney's ideas. You wouldn't believe the reading that they did. And a lot of the founders read the same things. They found that they had read the same things. They did a tremendous amount of reading to put this whole thing together. Let's get the next one. Okay, here's selected quotes from the discourses that I was telling you about. And down below there where it says, no law made by man can be perfect, there must be in every nation a power of correcting such defects as in time may arise or be discovered. Sometimes you got to correct the things that are wrong. The legislative power is always arbitrary and not to be trusted in the hands of any who are not bound to obey the laws they make. All right. Now he said this in the 17th century. How do you like that? You know why history repeats itself? How come history repeats itself? Why?
Ignorance of the past.
It's why? It's what?
We don't know our history.
Well, that too. You don't know your history, but there's a reason for history repeating itself. How come?
Because we don't learn from history.
Well, you don't learn from it. That's true. But there's another reason.
Nature.
Human nature. It never changes. It's the same. You have to work things out individually. That's the way it is. And when the Constitution was written, Madison made sure that that document was based upon human nature and principles from on high. How do you like that? Jefferson was quoted as saying, we want to bind them down, not with the Constitution, with the chains of the Constitution. We want to bind them down. We want to keep it strictly, you don't go out of this document. But 100 years later, when Jefferson was elected in 1801, his first term, but in 1901, we got a president who said, if the Constitution doesn't specifically prohibit me, I can do it. He spun it around on its head. Bev?
Well, I was going to say, he didn't mean bind down the people, he meant bind down the politicians.
But he was binding down politicians and binding human nature down with the Constitution. Because it's Constitution, if you read it, you've all read the Constitution, haven't you? But that's not enough, you got to study it. If you read it, it's a very limiting document. We're far away from it right now. It's hanging on a thread. I'd say it's hanging on a thread. Maybe not even that. Maybe a wet piece of paper. Well, okay. Now I want to get the next slide because that's an important one. You've got the. Oh no, it's in the other. It's in the other. Okay, it's all right. It's in the political philosophy one.
Well, I can open it back up.
Yeah, you open that, and I'll talk while you open it. And it's the last slide on that one. It's the last slide on the political philosophies. all of these men who spoke in the 17th century and the 16th century and the 18th century, the founders were well aware of them. Now, when they went to the Constitutional Convention, there were certain people that they discarded and certain people that they kept. They took a look at Plato and said, he's a crackpot, we're not going to use him at all. But then they took a look at John Locke and they said, here's the answers. We got answers here. This works. No, we want to go to, we don't want Beccaria. We want the English Bill of Rights. Go all the way to the end. Is that the end?
Wait a minute, that's the full one.
Anyway,
No.
you know, this is 2015, so we've got a lot of technology here. They wanted to do what worked when they got to Constitutional Convention. And they were very well schooled on the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. Now, let me go on a little bit. This is the English Bill of Rights we're looking for. I want to tell you a little bit more about the Anglo-Saxons. Okay? Thomas Jefferson discovered that the Anglo-Saxons and the first 5 books of the Old Testament were similar. And he had studied the Anglo-Saxons in their original tongue. They're from Germany and Scandinavia, and they were asked by the King of Kent in Britannia to help conquer the pagans. After defeating the pagans, the Angles and Saxons stayed, and I told you it's called Angleland and later changed to England. They brought a system of government which allowed liberty and freedom.
Is that one?
That's the one. Okay, good. And we'll keep that up there for a minute. Now, the greatest Anglo-Saxon king that we have on record was who? My father's named after him. Probably not, but anyway, it's my father's name. Anybody know who it is? King Alfred. King Alfred was from 877 to 899. He tried to copy the ancient law of Israel and the statutes of Moses from the Torah. That's King Alfred. He's an Anglo-Saxon king. Great king. And I want to read you you might be interested in some of the highlights of Anglo-Saxon law. Any powers granted by the people to their rulers were specifically described and strictly limited in scope. Government was by freely elected representatives to their General Assembly. No law or assessment of taxes could be imposed upon the people unless they or their representatives had consented to it. The king was surrounded by a council of wise men called the Wittegamat, or Witten, who could remove the king if he was incompetent or did not abide the law. In other words, the ruler was not above the law of the people. We always got to remember that our rulers are not above us. We elected them. A lot of people are saying now, well, I'm really concerned about the country. I think it's on its last leg, and we just don't seem to be able to do anything right. Listen, you can still vote. We still have the right to vote. That's a very important right that we need to take advantage of. A lot of people don't vote. But if you get people stirred up enough, they will vote. And that's an important right. Anglo-Saxon law also gave strong emphasis to local self-government, with very strict limitations on the powers given to the elected leaders. If you read carefully in the Torah and the book of Jeremiah and the book of Isaiah, if you read carefully, they talk about limiting things and spreading them out, separating the powers. The founders had read all that. Now, the entire code of justice was based on reparation to the victim. To the victim, not to the government. The reparations go to the victim. We got to start doing that. for any injury to his person or property. God's law was enforced with firmness and fairness. However, any person charged with a crime could demand a trial by jury of his peers. Some historians believe the jury system can be traced back to King Alfred and the Anglo-Saxons. How do you like that? Well, Jefferson had studied all that, and it just so happens the Anglo-Saxons went to the Black Sea area. They came from the Black Sea area, where we think 10 tribes were lost over there in the Black Sea area. And they were lost before going north. Well, there's a book of scripture called the Apocrypha. I don't know if anybody here has looked at that. But there's a very interesting statement in the Apocrypha from a book called the Second Esdras. Second Esdras is Second Ezra. Esdras is Ezra. And it says this about the 10 tribes. They would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt, that they might keep their statutes which they never kept in their own land. That's the 10 tribes that were lost. Well, that's where the Anglo-Saxons came from. And some scholars feel that there's a linkage between them and the Anglo-Saxons, because they were from the same areas. It's very possible. Well, let me read you something else. I'm going to read you some quotes from John Adams and Jefferson that you might not realize what these men were thinking. Now, if I had an overhead, I could show you this. What's that? Oh, you want to see me? Well, that's a good idea. Do you know what the first seal of the United States was? That was suggested. I have a picture of it. You're going to have to, if I had an overhead when I teach for the OLLI program for SOU and RCC, they have this overhead projector. You can put this down and it'll show it, but you can't do it with the kind we have here in the library. But on one side of the seal was Israel being led by a pillar of fire by Moses. On the other side of the seal was Hengist and Horsa. Who are they? Hengist and Horsa. Who's Hengist and Horsa? Now this was thought up by Jefferson. Hengist and Horsa were Anglo-Saxon kings. They came across. Now listen to this. On August 13th, 1776, Jefferson wrote to Edmund Pendleton to convince him that Virginia must abolish the remnants of feudalism and return to the ancient principles. We don't want people inheriting everything, inheriting positions in government. We want to have free plebiscites to elect people. And here's what Jefferson said. And he was always saying, we've got to go back to the ancient principles. When you read his writings, the ancient principles, he's talking about the Bible and he's talking about the Anglo-Saxon law, is what he's talking about. And he said this in this letter, are we not better? Now this is August 13, 1776, after he wrote those words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit, not happiness. You're not promised happiness, you're promised the pursuit. And to secure these rights, governments were instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of you and me, the government. Well, he wrote this letter to Pendleton and said, are we not better? For what we have hitherto abolished of the feudal system, they scrapped the feudal system completely. Has not every restitution of the ancient Saxon laws had happy effects? Is it not better now that we return at once into that happy system of our ancestors, the wisest and most perfect ever yet devised by the wit of man? as it stood before the 8th century. How do you like that? And in 3 generations, we've taken enough cyanide to commit suicide. We've completely forgotten all of this. All of this history. It's not being taught in the schools. It's not in the books. I just told you, I read that American pageant thing for 7 to 8 hours. I forced myself to read that. You don't have this kind of stuff in there. You've got stuff that, in my opinion, is biased. And it's written politically. Young people are not interested in the political part of it. Teach them history. Let them have the history. They'll sort it out. Well, John Adams said this about Jefferson's statements and about the seal that he proposed for the United States. Mr. Jefferson proposed the children of Israel in the wilderness, led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. This is Jefferson, who the historians say is not a religious man. And on the other side, Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs, from whom we claim the honor of being descended. We're Anglo-Saxons, see? And whose political principles and form of government we have assumed. How do you like that? John Adams said, we've assumed their form of government, and that's the best, and Jefferson said it's the best form ever by the wit of man, with the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Well, now let's talk about a little bit about the political structure. Let's go over here and talk about this, because this is very important. Can you all hear me through this? All right. Here's the continuum. Okay? What do you have all the way over here on the right? Now, there's a government continuum I'm drawing. So what's here to the extreme right?
Anarchy.
Anarchy. Anarchy. Anarchy's right. That's what? 0% government, right?
That's Obama.
So then what do you have all the way over here? You got tyranny. That's ruler's law. That's Nazism, fascism, communism. Okay, that's tyranny. All right? So let me tell you what the founders were trying to do. They were trying to go right here. And Aristotle called that the what? Golden mean. We got people that have come, they're taking notes, you know, they're studying their stuff. That's the golden mean. Okay, they want to come in between anarchy. You don't want anarchy because that's a French Revolution. That's where they behead everybody because they don't like what they believe and there's really no government there. Tyranny is no good form of government, but that's the human experience. That's what human history is. You sway from anarchy to tyranny. Well, the founders had a chance to sit down because they almost had anarchy. As a matter of fact, we did have anarchy in the United States when they had Shays' Rebellion, 1786. Daniel Shays from Massachusetts marched on the capital of Massachusetts because the farmers felt they were being taxed too much. And you know what happened? It was in the snow. They marched on the capital, and the militia. Americans were killing Americans. Militia gunned them down, and Daniel Shays ran away. Total anarchy. And Washington, I'm telling you, that was dark days because we didn't have a very strong form of government then. Well, the founders sat down in 1787, and we'll have a whole class on what they did there. We're going to have a whole class on the Constitutional Convention and the father of the Constitution. What all really happened there, because we're not getting the true story of what really happened. They wanted to come right here, and they came, England was about over here. England was the greatest form of government in a country ever. But you know what? They had a thing called the stamp tax, which was for how much? A penny! And they rose up against the penny! We're now 150 trillion in debt! Oh, that's all right. I'm going to... Oprah Winfrey's on. I don't have time for that. 1 penny! Well, they revolted against England, and they formed a government that came right about here. Now, you're not going to have, everybody says, yeah, but look at that, they're slaves. And what happened to the Native Americans, and the women didn't have the right to vote? Let me tell you something. If you want utopia, you're in the wrong place. This is not utopia here. This is, we're looking for the best society that we can get. But they put something in place where these things could be addressed. And they were. Now, this is where you want to go. When we first formed this government, what kind of a government did we have? What was the name of the government? Now, in 1916, we had a president named Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson ran on two items. First of all, I'm going to keep you out of war. That was the first lie. And then the second thing he said was, I'm going to keep you safe for
Democracy.
democracy. But we're not a democracy. That's not what we are. What are we? What kind of a republic? I pledge allegiance to the flag, to the republic. Well, what's this democracy stuff then? Well, let me tell you what the founders said about democracy. Now, this is the Federalist Papers. This is the book you haven't read yet. This is the book you need to read. And the best way to read it is out loud. Take it and read it out loud. And you'll read it slow, and you'll start to say, oh, he really said that. Did Madison really say this? Hence, it is. This is Federalist 10. That such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property. How do you like this? And have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government, this is Madison speaks in a very erudite way. You might want to have a dictionary with you when you have patronized this species of government, have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. You don't want that. You got about 60 people here tonight. Every one of you has a different intelligence. Every one of you has different skills. You don't want a society where everything is the same. Everybody makes the same money. Everybody does the same. That's not what you want. Communists tried that. It doesn't work. How come it doesn't work? That's socialism. Why doesn't, we're going to have a class next week, capitalism versus socialism. Why doesn't socialism work?
Because if one person works harder than another.
Because what?
If one person works harder
Yeah.
than another.
Yes.
Then, there's a problem if you're going to go the same way.
Well,
The same hours and the same.
what will happen if one works, let's say they're all making the same,
Lazier. The other one works hard and stop working.
they'll stop working. Human nature doesn't work this way. You work as hard as you can. You do as much as you can. If you're going to produce a government that is against human nature, the government will be a failure. You have to base it on human nature. There was a philosopher who really caused a lot of damage. His name was Rousseau. He's a French philosopher. He never did get married. He had 5 children, and he set them all out for adoption. He said you have to, you hear the same thing in the 20th century. that you have to have collective rights, not individual rights. Everything has to be collective. And he was trying to change your behavior by giving the government being the head of your behavior, inducing your behavior. That's not the way to change human nature. Human nature, you got to change yourself. You got to work on your own self. You don't need the government to work on you. That's a failure formula. That doesn't work. And they took Rousseau and they, in the French Revolution, and it was terrible. Very bad. Well, okay. Now, let's go on another step. James Wilson said, now who's he? Who's James Wilson? Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's little brother. Boy, you're sure smart. No, James Wilson was on the first Supreme Court of the United States. He came to America in 1765. He was a Scotsman. And he was at the Constitutional Convention. He was one of the real lights in the Constitutional Convention. And he was very close to Madison. Now, after the Constitutional Convention, they signed the Constitution on my birthday, by the way. They were very nice to do that, September 17th, 1787. I thanked them very much for that. I had my camcorder there and was, seeing what they were doing. After that, the states then got together and they had to ratify it. See, the Constitution's only a skeleton. It was only a skeleton. The meat and potatoes and the bones of it, the real mass of it, was put on at the ratifying conventions. And James Wilson was from where? Where's he from? I don't want to walk over there.
From
I'm going to write it.
Scotland?
He's from where?
From Scotland, originally?
He was from Scotland, but what state was he from? Anybody know?
Massachusetts.
New York? No. But he's from a neighboring state. Pennsylvania. He's from Pennsylvania. And he was the light. Now, they weren't sure Pennsylvania was going to pass on the Constitution, but he got up and, my goodness, every time somebody had a question or had a contradiction, James Wilson got up and said, no, you're not right about that. I was there, and this is the way it was. Oh, well, darn it. I don't like you correcting me all the time. So anyway, Pennsylvania voted pretty overwhelmingly for it. I think it was 66 to 22, something like that. It was a very overwhelming vote. And they all said, oh, we passed, we ratified. Now we're going to go and have something, go to the local tavern. We're going to celebrate. But first, we want to hear from Wilson. So he gets up on the podium and starts talking. And lo and behold, you had people with stakes and wooden lumber and so forth. And they were beating Wilson. They got him on the ground, almost beat him to death. And he was saved by some others that were for him. I'm going to tell you, this was high emotional times. This was not a walk in the park. We shouldn't be a country. You look at this. Look at it with some open eyes. We shouldn't have a constitution. We shouldn't have a Bill of Rights. That's Madison again. We shouldn't have won the Revolutionary War. We're going to go through that. I think it's in lesson 4, where Washington creates America. We should never have won that war. We shouldn't have won the War of 1812. I'm going to tell you, you're taking a lot for granted out there. This is an amazing story here. Wilson said a free government has often been compared to a pyramid. This illusion is made with peculiar propriety in the system before you. It is laid on the broad basis of the people. Its powers gradually rise while they are confined in proportion as they ascend. They end in that most permanent of all forms, a chain of connection with the people. Now, when Moses was in the wilderness, and this is in Exodus, the 18th chapter, when he was in the wilderness, he was interviewing everybody. There was about 3 million people there. He was interviewing for every little thing. His father-in-law came along. His father-in-law's named Jethro. He came along and said, "Look, this isn't good what you're doing. You're doing this from day to night. You gotta divide this up. You gotta delegate this and turn this all around. Turn this around so that the people, you're going to divide it in tens and 20s and 50s and hundreds and thousands. Divide the whole thing up, divide the authority up, and that way you don't have to do it. You only have to listen to the major stuff." Well, that's what James Wilson's talking about. See, they had very carefully read the Bible, and they knew all this. Jefferson said this: "The way to have good and safe government is not to trust it all to one, but to divide it among the many, distributing to everyone exactly the functions he or she is competent to. Let the national government be entrusted with the defense of the nation and its foreign and federal relations. That's a national responsibility. You can't, the states can't be defending the nation because you've got 50 states. You've got to have a national government to do that. The state governments with the civil rights, laws, police, and administration of what concerns the states generally. The counties with the local concerns of the counties, and each ward directs the interests within itself. It is by dividing and subdividing these republics from the great national one down through all its subordinations until it ends in the administration of every man's farm by himself, by placing under everyone that his own eye may superintend that all will be done for the best." You break it all up. Now, I want to read you something else. A few other things from the Federalist Papers. And this is, if I was king for a day, I would make it mandatory to graduate high school that every school child has got to read the Constitution and take a test on it, read the Declaration of Independence, take a test on it, and read various parts of the Federalist Papers and take a test on it. So they become familiar with it. Now you're going to say, well, that's crazy. You can't do that. You want to bet they do it in North Carolina? Oh, well. I want to read you, a lot of people say, well, you know what? The founders were not, they wrote this document, but it's out of date. It's antiquated now. It doesn't work anymore. They were only writing it for those people then anyway. Right? Wrong. Let me read you this by Madison. "Happily for America, happily we trust, for the whole human race. They," now Madison was very self-effacing. He never took credit for anything. He's talking about the people who wrote the document. He was there. He was the main cog. He didn't say I, he said they. "They pursued a new and more noble course. They accomplished a revolution which has no parallel in the annals of human society." He would know because he read 200 books from 1784 to 1786. Gail?
What would you say to those who say it's a living document that can be is very flexible and that we can change to accommodate our time?
I would read the 14th Federalist because I'm going to answer that in just a minute. That's a good question. And Madison answered that. "They accomplished a revolution which has no parallel in the annals of human society. They," it's always they, like he wasn't there, "they reared the fabrics of governments which have no model on the face of the globe. They formed the design of a great confederacy, which it is incumbent," and this will answer Gail's question, "it is incumbent on their successors to improve and perpetuate." Now, how do you improve it? You amend. There's a process. You want to improve it? Amend. But to say that it's a living, breathing document is they haven't done their homework. It's not true. It's true if you don't want restrictions on your actions. Then it's a good thing, because then you can do whatever you want. Every morning you wake up with a smile, because you just do whatever you want. But that's not the intention. You had a shogun in, I guess it was Japan, right? You had a king in France at this time. You had a sultan in Turkey. That was the world that they were living in. Let me read you something by Martin Luther King in 1963. His great speech he made. When the architects of our republic, he knew it was a republic, but it's a certain kind of a republic. What kind of a republic is this? Did the founders bequeath to us that we've thrown away? A constitutional democratic republic, because China's got a republic. Soviet Union was a republic. They said they were. That's a certain kind of a republic. So Martin Luther King said, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. And the promissory note was Declaration of Independence. It had a Constitution. Now, when the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence signed it, they signed their death certificate. Your birth certificate, our birth certificate, their death certificate. This book, American Pageant, keep coming back to this book, but it doesn't bring that out. That's a very important piece, because they gave their lives, their fortunes, and what else? Sacred honor. Boy, that was important, because some of those who signed the Declaration of Independence lost their lives. Their families were put in prison. Their houses, they went bankrupt. They died in debtor's prison. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. We're concerned if we go to 7-Eleven, there's not a big gulp there. I mean, you know, we have to realize the sacrifices made. Let me read you this. Madison, again, in the 45th Federalist, talks about our form of government. And this might interest you. This is on page 292 and 293 of the Federalist. It's the 45th Federalist. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Now, I told you before, when Jefferson was president in 1801, he said if it's not in the document, you can't do it. But then 100 years later, in 1901, the president said, if it doesn't prohibit me, I can do it. So he put it on its head, see? But that's not what Madison said. He said, those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. See, in our form of government, you got a 10th Amendment. And what's that say? What's the 10th Amendment say?
Yeah.
Anything not defined goes back to the states.
Yes, it goes back to the states. And I'll read you the words. Whoops. Can you hear me without this?
Well, I can.
No?
I can, but maybe not back
Better
there.
with? Can you hear now?
Great.
Here's the 10th Amendment. We've completely obliterated the 10th Amendment. That's the Bill of Rights, you know. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. So in other words, if it isn't enumerated in the constitutional document, the states. Now we have a big struggle on a lot of social issues today. Today, in 1973, we had a decision called Roe versus Wade. Has anybody read that decision here? Very good. Excellent. You read Justice Blackmun's opinion?
I went to the law library, now I'm in the courthouse, and read the
Good.
entire document.
Well, Justice Blackmun is the one who was assigned to write it. It is a hodgepodge of insanity. You have to read it. Forget the issue. The issue was about abortion, but forget that. You need to read the decision. Now, is there anything in the Constitution about this? No. So what does that mean? It's a state issue. States. States have to make that decision. Each state needs to make that decision. Well, we've obliterated that. And one thing we need to do, and I'm going to talk in the 7th installation of this series, how you can restore America. And one thing you have to do is repeal the 17th Amendment. Now, what's the 17th Amendment? It's the election of senators. Election of senators, and that came in 1913. It hasn't worked. It doesn't work because there's tremendous amounts of money being raised, and you don't have the accountability that you had before. How'd they used to do it? When Lincoln ran against Douglas for the Senate in 1858, how did Douglas get elected?
State legislature.
State legislature. Lincoln won the debate, but he didn't get elected. Douglas was appointed because there was more Democrats in the legislature, and they appointed Douglas. There were an increased amount of Republicans that won in the legislature, but there wasn't enough. Now, if your senator comes back into your district, and let's say he's appointed by the legislature, that emboldens and emblazons states' rights, see, which we've lost. So the senator comes back, look, I just got you a sewage plant for Ashland. I got federal monies and I got you a sewage plant. And he goes back to state legislature and says, we don't want you to do that. Well, what do you mean? I just got a whole bunch of money for it. We'll do it. We don't want you to do that. And if you do that again, we're not going to appoint you. Oh my goodness. He's got to report to the state. See, that's not what's happening now. We've lost that. We severed that. It hasn't worked. So now we need to go back and we need to repeal that. So Madison said the states have the power. Now, has anybody read Andrew Jackson's veto message of the Bank of the United States? Probably nobody. I suggest, there's some young people in here. You've read it, Eric? Good for you. This is better than any Federalist paper. Every young person should read this. If I was teaching in the high school, I'd have them read this veto message because it tells you what the American government was like for the 7th president and what he did. And he overruled the Supreme Court.
Say again, who wrote that?
Jackson, Andrew Jackson. His veto message to the bank. Does the president have the right to overrule the Supreme Court? No? How come?
I don't know.
Separation of powers.
Well, we're going to go to your foundation. Anybody think that the president has the right? Jim does.
Congress does.
Anybody have an opinion on that? What's the purpose of the executive? What is he supposed to do?
Well, you have separation of powers.
There's separation of powers, but where does the power really lie in our form of government?
Senate and
It's
Congress.
in the legislature, isn't it? Okay, now wait a minute. This is why I want you to read the Federalist Papers. I'm going to give you a homework assignment. I want you to go home tonight, after you have an adult beverage. I want you to go home, and I want you to get out the Federalist Paper, because you might go to a cocktail party, I don't know. And in the cocktail party, you'll be able to tell them this. You say, hey, have you read the 78th Federalist lately? They say, no, what, the 78th Federalist? I just had a cheeseburger at McDonald's. I don't know what that is. He says, well, you better read the 78th Federalist. Well, why should I read that? Well, because it tells you that the judiciary has no power at all. What are you talking about? Well, the Supreme Court really is not the final word. As a matter of fact, it's the weakest branch of government. Where'd you get that from? Well, do you know who Alexander Hamilton is? Well, yeah, he's a grocer at my delicatessen. No, not that one. The one who wrote the Federalist Papers, because he said, the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution. I'm going to read you this. I'm going to read you part of this. I want you to read this tonight. I want you to go home after this and read the 78th Federalist in the Federalist Papers that you didn't buy.
So is it online?
Yeah, I probably it's online. Yeah. Then he says this, because it will be least in a capacity to annoy or injure them. The executive, what does the executive do? He executes. He executes the law. Jackson said to John Marshall, you've written the law, now go enforce it. He couldn't. That's right. Because, see, the president takes an oath. He swears an oath to the Constitution. So does the Congress. Same oath that the Supreme Court takes. So what, they're not supposed to uphold the Constitution? The executive not only dispenses the honors, but holds the sword of the community. The legislature, that's where the power is, legislature, but we're not doing that now. We're not doing that. We're leaving it to the Supreme Court, which is wrong. Well, enough people get to feel that the Supreme Court only gives an opinion. When you read what they say, it's an opinion. Legislature not only commands the person, but prescribes the rules by which the duties and rights of every citizen are to be regulated. The judiciary, on the contrary, has no influence over either the sword or the purse. No direction either of the strength or the wealth of society, not today, but this is the original intention, and can take no active resolution whatever. Now listen to this. I don't even like Hamilton. I never have liked him. But boy, he was powerful in the 78th Federalist. It may truly be said that the judiciary has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. You give an opinion, that's it. And most must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive arm, even for the efficacy of its judgments. Oh, I want to tell you, we have gone we're way off beam. And then he goes on to say, I won't read the rest to you, but he goes on to say it's the weakest of the three. By the way, when we went to school, we were told that it's co-equal departments. That's not true. It's a myth. We've been taught a myth, I'm telling you. You don't have to believe me, but go study it yourself. That's a myth. The judiciary is much weaker than the legislature or the executive. Oh, well. You go home and read it. All right, and read, have your children read Jackson's veto message.
What was he vetoing again, please?
What's that?
What was he vetoing again?
He vetoed the U.S. Bank, which is today called the Federal Reserve. He vetoed it. All right, now, we talked about the Magna Carta. There is no divine right of kings, and we talked about the petition of right. I want to talk about this, but first I want to talk about another man. Another man who had a chance to be George Washington. But see, there was only one George Washington. We don't have any other. We have nobody in recorded history like this. There's only one. But there was a man who had a chance to be him. And who was that? In the middle of the 17th century. In England. Oliver Cromwell. He led a cavalry against Charles, who had been caught consorting with other countries against England committing high treason. Charles was caught and escaped. Charles eventually was caught again and was executed by a parliamentary edict in 1649. I told you they beheaded him, and he sat there with his what do you call that hat with the feather in it? Gail, do you know what that's called? It's a cockeyed hat. There's a name for it. It's got a feather. Anyway, he had this big hat, and he said, "You're not going to do anything to me. I'm the king." Well, they beheaded him. He was gone because the Parliament thought he committed treason. Well, then up popped Oliver Cromwell, and Cromwell found himself in the exact spot that a century later George Washington occupied. Same thing. Cromwell had a chance to be a hero. He could have walked away from power. How many do you know that will walk away from power? In the history of, recorded history of the world. Very few that I can mention. Cincinnatus the Roman. That's about it. But Washington was here when we needed it. At the exact time that we had to have it. Well, Cromwell found himself in that position. He assumed the political leadership of England and Ireland and Scotland. He wanted a written constitution, and he wanted to set up a Magna Carta type rights for all. You're always getting back to that Magna Carta, the rights of free Englishmen. See, we get a lot of our history from England. Founders had studied all of that. When they were deciding how to put a government together, Thomas Jefferson was in France. He was a minister to France. And he sent 200 books to James Madison in 1784. And he said, if you read these 200 books, my goodness, there were dictionaries, there were histories, and you read the Federalist Papers and you'd say, well, Madison read them all in 2 years. 2 years, he studied 200 books. You know where he went to school? Little country school. Small little country school. He was 10 years old and they were studying Plutarch. Lives of Plutarch. And now we're studying condoms, I think, or something. I mean, it's incredible where we've come from. Well, he sent Madison the 200 books and he read them all, and he was all ready for what was to take place. He had studied up. He almost killed himself in the study habits that he had. Almost killed himself. He was getting 5 hours sleep. I'll tell you, 5 hours sleep isn't enough. You just can't get away on that. Finally, he said, I can't do this anymore. I got to get more than 5 hours. I think I'll get 5 hours and 5 minutes. But I just can't get 5 hours. Well, Cromwell wanted a written constitution to set up Magna Carta type rights for all. He had to postpone those ideas to fight Scotland and Ireland. England had a constitution for a short time, but Parliament and Cromwell discarded it. And then we had a dictatorship. And Cromwell became very, very unpopular. He became hated for his abusive conduct to the people. He had arrests without due process, taxation without representation, and then he died of malaria, and Charles II took over. Well, Charles II took over, and that's where Algernon Sidney came onto the scene, and I showed you him before. And he said, if the oppressive, we have a God-given right to overthrow it. And the founders had read his writings, And they beheaded him too. Algernon Sidney was beheaded. And then we have these two who came across, and they were given the throne of England, and in 1689 we had the English Bill of Rights. The founders had carefully studied the English Bill of Rights. Building on earth, this is William and Mary. That's who this is. Building on earlier documents such as the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, further limited the power. You've got to limit the power of the monarchy. Now, in the Constitution, which article specifically spells out what the executive should do? Article 2. See, Article 1 is the legislature. That's the important one. Article 2 is very short. Not much in there. Now the president does everything. He tells you can get a job. How many jobs you can get. What the environment should be. He's got responsibilities for everything. There's nothing in there in the Constitution about this. This is happened over a course of time. Well, you had William and Mary. They reasserted Parliament's authority to control taxation and legislation. You gotta put that in the hands of the Parliament. Is our Congress, and why does Parliament? Why does Congress have the ability to declare war? Why was that put in there? You know, when you go to war, you have to declare it. We don't do that much anymore, but you need to declare war, and it's put in there in the Congress. Why did the founders put it in there?
Yeah, pay for it.
So they represent people.
He does what? They represent the people. You want to have a war, you better get buy-in from the people. That's what the legislature or the Parliament or the Congress does. That's the people. See, the founders had 4 months. They discussed all this. They sat down and discussed it. In a little building, they had all the windows closed. And I grew up in Philadelphia, and it gets awfully hot in the summertime. You got all those obese men in there. I mean, it was just miserable. And they were in that room, and they hammered it out, and they only really had 3 compromises. The rest of it was all consensus. Took 60 ballots to elect an executive. 60 ballots. They're talking it out. Everybody has their say. You got 2. Everybody can speak twice on one topic. You can't speak anymore. Some people today, they get the microphone, they never let the microphone alone. Twice, that's all you can talk. And they hammered this thing out, and they were very concerned about Article 2 because they had an experience with England that was very bad. But they looked in the room and they said, here's going to be our first president. So let's develop our ideas after Washington. Well, the drafters of the United States Constitution borrowed many ideas from the English Bill of Rights. After the Glorious Revolution, which was in 1688, Parliament invited William and Mary to rule England so long as they agreed to certain conditions. They wanted those rights from the Magna Carta. You're not going to take away due process again. Cromwell took it away. Taxation without representation, we're not going to do that. William and Mary to rule England so long as they agreed to certain conditions. Accepting the English Bill of Rights was one of those conditions, and William and Mary accepted it. They accepted the English Bill of Rights. All right. Then we have, just before this, in 1679, Parliament enacted habeas corpus. What's that? Bring the body here. Bring it before us. They outlawed holding prisoners without any violation and being charged for crimes against the state. Finally, in 1689, you have the English Bill of Rights, which I talked about, was written without a struggle, and James II abdicated, fleeing England in a bloodless coup. And William and Mary signed this as co-rulers of England, which included this. Number 1, free speech. What is free speech? Where is that in our Constitution?
First
What does the First Amendment say about that?
Make no law.
Why is free speech important?
Speak out against the government.
They do what?
You can speak out against the government.
Well, that's right, and there's a lot of countries in the world that don't have that. You know, the old, you know that story of the Russian talking to the American when they had the Soviet Union, and the American says, "We have free speech here," and the Russian says, "Well, we have free speech too." He says, "What do you mean you have free speech? We have free speech. We can talk out and we can say anything we want." He says, "Well, I've got free speech. I can go into Premier Gorbachev, pound his desk, and then I'll be thrown in jail. But I can speak." Well, here's the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. What does that mean? It's what is an establishment of religion?
Creating the church.
It's a church. It's a specific church. It's not prayer. It's not prayer in the schools. That's not an establishment of religion. That's not unconstitutional. The courts ruled on that in the 1940s, but it's not unconstitutional. Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof of religion, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. You can go to your congressman and petition them if you have a redress of grievances. You have the right to peaceably assemble, but you don't have the right to unpeaceably assemble. Well, in the English Bill of Rights, you had free speech, you had the freedom to petition your government, no church courts. They separated the church from the state. You had free elections, no standing army in peacetime, frequent meetings of Parliament, no cruel and unusual. What is cruel and unusual punishment? We have an amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. Which amendment is that? It's the 8th Amendment. And cruel and unusual punishment is what? Is it going to the electric chair?
Nope.
Why isn't that cruel and unusual punishment?
Because the Bible basically says that we have a right to put somebody to death if they're...
You have to have the death penalty.
Yeah.
Because you have such heinous crimes. Now, we've got heinous crimes going on in the country that we're putting people in jail for life that really we should reconsider what we're doing here. Because you have to have the death penalty against heinous crime. Now, cruel and unusual punishment is what England was doing, where they were quartering, boiling oil on you, and chopping you all up and throwing you, and then nobody knew what the last resting place of that person was. And they'd also put you on the rack, and they'd spread the rack out until it was just terrible. That's cruel and unusual punishment. Crucifixion is cruel and unusual punishment. We don't do that kind of stuff. Electric chair is not. Injection is not cruel and unusual punishment.
What about hanging?
Hanging is not cruel and unusual punishment.
Is the deciding factor?
It's you have to, if you have a death penalty, you have to be able to carry it out in some form. But you just don't want it in a barbaric form if you carry that out. And that's the states can decide how they're going to do that.
So is how swift the death occurs the deciding factor?
Well, that would certainly be a deciding factor, how swiftly it would occur. Mm-hmm. If you lengthen it out,
then that'd be
it would become cruel and unusual. It could. That's very right. Well, okay. Now, before the country took effect, you had to have these men. I wish I had an overhead for you, but I don't. These men discovered all of these various places. In the 1500s, you had Spain was in charge. In the 1600s, France. In the 1700s, England. You had to have Columbus. because you had to have him explore this hemisphere and discover it before you had any rights put in or any freedoms put in. And people were looking for religious rights that they weren't getting in Europe. And they discovered this new country. And others came. You had, what's his name? Giovanni Cabuto. Who's that?
Tractor builder?
That's John Cabot. That was his name. And he came over here and he went up the New England area. He looked at that. You know, all those men that came over, sacrificed and came over here and did all that. You had the Coronado, Grand Canyon, Ponce de Leon, the Fountain of Youth, and you had De Soto and Pizarro, and you had others. Jacques Cartier came across, the Frenchman, and he discovered Chino Falls up there around New York. What's Chino Falls mean? China's that away. They were looking for China. They were looking for Northwest Passage. Well, so they all came across, and today, now Columbus was not the first. Columbus gets a very bad name today. He, again, is taught in a very different way. But the Western Hemisphere was known by voyages from the Phoenicians. The Greeks came over, the Egyptians, Asiatic Wei Cha in 500 CE, and the Vikings, of course, Newfoundland. So that set the tone. But then we had, let's see, is Mary here? Mary, I need the Mayflower Compact. We had a document in 1620, a very short little document. That one's on antecedent documents. Is that what we're on? Or is that the other one?
Yeah, but you need the full one, right?
Yeah, and it's the last one on antecedent documents. Yes.
I think all
Right
I have-
there.
I think all I have is the shortened one.
Oh, did you put the Mayflower Compact on that one?
No.
All right, well, when you find it, we'll talk about it. But anyway, we had the Mayflower Compact.
Oh, there it is.
You got it?
Yeah.
There you go. Okay. There it is, 1620. All right, this was a piece of history that needs to be taught. But I want to tell you something. There's no time to teach all this. You don't get that much American history anymore. This was the first political document composed in America. It contains the essence of a free government. The signers of the compact agreed to establish just and equal laws for the general good, promised submission and obedience to those laws. Signed aboard the Mayflower, this short but remarkable document would influence the eventual form of the United States government. Well, I happen to have it with me, and I want to read you from that. I shall a little return back, this was Bradford, and begin with a combination made by them before they came ashore, being the first foundation of their government in this place, occasioned partly by the discontented and mutinous speeches that some of the strangers amongst them had let fall from them in the ship, that when they came ashore they would use their own liberty, for none had power to command them, the patent they had being for Virginia and not for New England, which belonged to another government, with which the Virginia Company had nothing to do, and partly that such an act by them done, this their condition considered, might be as firm as any patent and in some respects more sure. The form was as followeth: In the name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James. He was dread. He was terrible. Absolutely terrible. He thought he was equal to God. I've got the quotes. I want to tell you something. History does repeat itself because of human nature. You get somebody with a lot of power, they start to think they are God. It's a very dangerous part of human nature. You've got to control human nature. That's the key of all of this. And King James was... now, we named the King James Bible is very good. I suggest that. But King James, I don't suggest. The dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God. God's always in the picture. You throw God out, you're going to get in trouble. An advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God Almighty and one of another, covenant, and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland, the 54th Anno Domini 1620. That's the Mayflower Compact. And I want to tell you, the founders had read all of this. They had mulled it over. They had read the writings of all the great philosophers that they wanted to keep. They had read the writings of Adam Smith. They formed a great economy that worked for a very long time. We'll go a little bit into him next week. But they had really put their lives and their sacred honor on the line. Gail?
I recently read a book that said that the seeds of our form of government was sown by the Iroquois Federation.
Yeah, that's not exactly right.
I didn't hear what you said.
That's around, but that isn't exactly right. There were some pieces of that look similar. I want to read you something that happened that's very important. In 1775, April 23rd. What was the largest colony in America?
Virginia.
Virginia. Virginia had about 750,000 people. And Delaware had about 30,000. See, that's why at the Constitutional Convention, the small states were ready to leave. Because they didn't want equal representation in the Senate. Because they would lose out. They didn't have the voting power. They would lose representation. And John Dickinson went up to Madison, who was taking the notes, pointed a finger at Madison. He said, Mr. Madison, we think that you are in charge of writing this Virginia plan, but we will never sign on to this unless you change that article in there that has equal representation by population. We will never sign. As a matter of fact, we're going to leave. Oh my goodness, a chill went up the spine of the founders when he did that. They had to give in to that. They had representation wasn't what had to be equalized some way. But they talked it out, and they talked it out. They voted and voted and voted, and finally they voted the way that we have today. Now, with a few changes. On March 23rd, 1775, Virginia, being the largest colony in America, met to decide in St. John's Church in Richmond whether they were going to be part of America in fighting with Massachusetts. Some resolutions were presented by Patrick Henry, putting the colony of Virginia into a posture of defense, embodying, arming, and disciplining such a number of men as may be sufficient for the purpose. Now I'm going to read you part of this speech. We don't have anybody talking like this anymore. We need the young people to learn this stuff so that they can save America. That's why they need to know this. Here's what Patrick Henry said. If we wish to be free, this was towards the end of his speech. He gave a speech extemporaneously, no notes. He had 17 children. King of England had 15 and went insane. I don't think he went insane for the children, but Patrick Henry said, if we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges for which we have been so long contending, if we mean not basely to abandon the noble struggle in which we have been so long engaged and which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon, until the glorious object of our contest shall be obtained, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight and appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us. Because England was going to decapitate you for treason. You know, they catch those signers of the Declaration of Independence and those main patriots, they were done, they were toast. Henry goes on, they tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be the next week or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard shall be stationed in every house? Shall we gather strength by irresolution and inaction? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs and hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemies shall have bound us hand and foot? Sir, we are not weak. If we make a proper use of the means which the God of nature hath placed in our power, 3 millions of people, armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country as that which we possess, are invincible any force which our enemy can send against us. Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destiny of nations, and who will raise up friends to battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, sir, we have no election. If we were base enough to desire it, it is now too late to retire from the contest. He's speaking to the Virginia delegates. They don't want to vote for going to war. Then he goes on, says this, there is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sir, let it come. It is in vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that the gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. We don't hear that today. We have to have a backbone. We've got to have people that have rods of steel up their spine, because the culture now has changed. It's changed markedly from what it was. And we're going to have to be vigilant and fight the good fight.